May 4th, 1886. Haymarket Square, Chicago. A warm spring evening turns into chaos in 7 seconds. A bomb arcs through the air, trailing sparks like a falling star. It lands among a line of police officers. The explosion tears through flesh and bone. 7 officers fall dead. 60 more lie wounded, screaming in the darkness. Gunfire erupts, police shooting into the crowd, workers shooting back, bystanders caught in the crossfire. When the smoke clears, at least 4 civilians lie dead, dozens more bleeding in the streets. This wasn't random violence. This was the culmination of decades of labor exploitation, of workers ground down by machines and 14-hour days, of children losing fingers in factories, of families starving while industrialists built mansions. This was the moment when America's working class said enough and paid for that defiance with their lives. The Haymarket Affair had become one of the most consequential events in American labor history. It would lead to the execution of innocent men, spark international outrage, and ultimately help secure the 8-hour workday that we take for granted today. But the path from that bloody square to your 40-hour work week was paved with bodies, built on lies, and soaked in the blood of workers who dared to demand dignity. This is the story of Haymarket, of the 8 martyrs who died for a dream, of a trial that was a mockery of justice, of how a bomb that killed 7 people gave birth to a movement that changed the world. Key insight: the Haymarket Affair represents the violent collision between industrial exploitation and workers' resistance, a single night of bloodshed that would transform labor rights across the globe. The reality behind the rhetoric: the 1880s, America's Gilded Age. The name itself is telling: gilded, not golden. A thin layer of gold covering rot underneath. While industrialists like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt accumulated wealth beyond imagination, the workers who generated that wealth lived in conditions that resembled medieval serfdom. Working conditions: the average worker in 1886 labored 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 days a week, 72 to 96 hours weekly. There were no weekends as we know them. Sunday was the only guaranteed day off, and even that was often violated. Factories operated around the clock. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were fired and replaced within hours. The labor pool was endless. Immigrants poured into American cities by the hundreds of thousands, desperate for any work at any wage. The factories: step inside a Chicago meatpacking plant in 1886. The temperature hovers around 40 degrees. Blood and animal fat cover every surface. Workers stand in 3 inches of bloody water, wielding knives with hands so cold they can barely feel the cuts accumulating on their fingers. The air reeks of death and chemicals. Men work 14-hour shifts, their backs bent, their hands cramping, their lungs filling with noxious fumes. Move to a steel mill. The heat is unbearable. Furnaces blasting at 3,000 degrees. Workers feed iron ore into the flames, their faces blistering from the heat, their clothing catching fire regularly. Men lose arms to the machinery. There are no safety guards, no emergency stops, no workers' compensation. If you're injured, you're fired. If you're killed, your family receives nothing. The company simply hires your replacement before your body is cold. Child labor. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, coal mines, and glass factories. Small fingers were perfect for reaching into machinery to clear jams. Fingers that were frequently crushed, severed, or mangled. Children worked the same 12 to 14-hour shifts as adults, earning a fraction of adult wages. They developed deformities from repetitive motions, respiratory diseases from toxic dust, and suffered injury rates even higher than adults due to fatigue and smaller stature. Wages and poverty. The average worker earned approximately $10 to $15 per week, barely enough to rent a tenement room and buy basic food. Families of 6 or 7 people lived in single rooms without running water, adequate ventilation, or sanitation. Disease was rampant. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis killed thousands annually in working-class neighborhoods, while wealthy districts remained largely untouched. No safety net. There was no workers' compensation, no health insurance, no unemployment benefits, no disability payments, no retirement pensions. If you were injured at work, you simply stopped earning money. Families plunged into destitution overnight. Women and children were forced into even more dangerous and degrading work to survive. The cycle of poverty was inescapable. You worked until you were injured, sick, or dead, and then your family began the same doomed trajectory. Company control. Many workers didn't even receive cash wages. Instead, they were paid in company scrip, currency only redeemable at company-owned stores where prices were inflated 30 to 50% above market rates. Workers lived in company-owned housing, shopped at company stores, and existed in a state of permanent debt to their employers. This was wage slavery with a different name, the 8-hour movement. Against this backdrop of exploitation, workers began organizing around a simple demand: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. The 8-hour day. It sounds modest today. Most of us work 8-hour shifts, but in 1886, this was revolutionary. This was workers claiming that their lives belonged to themselves, not to their employers. That they were human beings deserving of rest, family time, and dignity. The movement spread rapidly. Labor organizations grew from scattered local groups to national federations. The Knights of Labor, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, anarchist collectives, socialist parties. Diverse groups united around the 8-hour demand. They set a date, May 1st, 1886. If employers did not voluntarily grant the 8-hour day, workers would strike. Key insight: industrial America in the 1880s operated on a system of brutal exploitation where workers were treated as disposable machinery, creating conditions that made violent confrontation inevitable when workers organized to reclaim basic human dignity. The strike wave and the McCormick Massacre, April to May 1886. May 1st, 1886. 340,000 workers across America walked off their jobs. In Chicago alone, the center of the labor movement, 80,000 workers struck. The city ground to a halt. Factories stood silent. Railways stopped running. Construction sites emptied. The working class had made its stand. The strikes were largely peaceful. Workers marched through streets carrying banners. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Families joined the demonstrations, women, children, elderly workers, creating a carnival atmosphere. For a brief moment, workers glimpsed what collective power felt like. They weren't begging. They were demanding. The response: Chicago's business elite panicked. The city's newspapers, owned by industrialists, published hysterical editorials warning of revolution, comparing strikers to European anarchists and violent radicals. The Chicago Tribune called for a little hanging to restore order. The Chicago Times suggested using Gatling guns on strike crowds. Police were mobilized in unprecedented numbers, many of them armed with new Winchester repeating rifles. The McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, one of Chicago's largest employers, had locked out its workers months earlier, replacing union members with strikebreakers. On May 3rd, striking lumber workers held a rally near the McCormick plant. August Spies, a German immigrant and anarchist newspaper editor, addressed the crowd about the 8-hour movement. The violence erupts. As Spies spoke, the McCormick factory whistle blew, signaling the end of the shift. Some striking workers broke away from the rally and confronted the strikebreakers leaving the plant. Taunts were exchanged. Rocks were thrown. Then, without warning or provocation, 200 police officers charged into the crowd, clubs swinging. Officers opened fire with revolvers. Workers scattered, but many were too slow. 6 workers were shot dead. Dozens more were wounded, beaten, or trampled in the panic. Spies' response. August, Spies witnessed the massacre. He watched police shoot unarmed workers in the back as they fled. He saw officers club wounded men lying in the street. That evening, Spies returned to his newspaper office and wrote a circular, a 1-page flyer calling for a protest meeting the next evening, May 4th, at Haymarket Square. The circular's headline read, "Revenge, Working Men to Arms." Though Spies later had that inflammatory version edited to remove the call to arms, approximately 2,500 copies of the original had already been distributed. The protest was scheduled for 7:30 p.m. on May 4th at Haymarket Square, a wide commercial space near Randolph Street used for farmers markets. The location was chosen because It could accommodate a large crowd, and because it symbolized the connection between workers and farmers, both groups exploited by industrial capitalism. The McCormick Massacre transformed the 8-hour movement from an economic dispute into a life-or-death struggle, radicalizing workers who witnessed the state's willingness to murder citizens for demanding shorter workdays. The evening of May 4th was unseasonably warm. Workers began gathering at Haymarket Square around 7:30 p.m., though the crowd was smaller than anticipated. Perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people, rather than the expected tens of thousands. Many workers stayed home, exhausted from days of striking or frightened by the previous day's violence. August spies arrived and climbed onto a wagon that served as a speaker's platform. He addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the square. He spoke about the McCormick killings, about workers' right to organize, about the 8-hour movement. His speech was measured, not inflammatory. Witnesses later testified it was actually quite tame compared to his usual rhetoric. The speakers, after spies Albert Parsons, spoke. Parsons was a former Confederate soldier turned radical labor organizer, married to Lucy Parsons, a black and indigenous woman who was herself a fierce labor activist. Parsons spoke about economic inequality, about the growing gap between rich and poor, about the necessity of workers' solidarity. His speech lasted nearly an hour. The final speaker was Samuel Fielden, an English immigrant and Methodist minister turned labor organizer. Fielden's speech focused on workers' rights and peaceful resistance. Chicago's mayor, Carter Harrison, was actually present in the crowd, monitoring the gathering. He later testified that the speeches were not incendiary and that the crowd was orderly. Satisfied there would be no violence, Mayor Harrison left around 10 p.m., stopping at the nearby police station to tell Inspector John Bonfield that the meeting was peaceful and could be allowed to continue. The weather turns. Around 10 p.m., clouds rolled in and rain began to fall. The crowd, already smaller than expected, began to disperse. Perhaps 300 people remained when Fielden concluded his speech around 10:20 p.m. The police advance. Despite Mayor Harrison's assessment, Inspector Bonfield decided to disperse the meeting. He assembled 176 officers in formation at the nearby Des Plaines Street Police Station. At approximately 10:30 p.m., as Fielden was concluding his remarks, the police column marched into Haymarket Square in military formation. Captain William Ward commanded the column. He shouted, "I command you in the name of the people of the state of Illinois to immediately and peaceably disperse." Fielden responded from the wagon, "We are peaceable." He began to climb down from the wagon. The crowd started to scatter. The bomb. Then, from a narrow alley on the east side of the square, someone threw a bomb. Witnesses described it as a spherical object, about the size of an orange, trailing sparks from a lit fuse. It arced through the air in a lazy parabola. It landed in the police formation, approximately 15 feet from Captain Ward. The bomb detonated with a tremendous blast. The explosion was heard blocks away. Shrapnel, pieces of the bomb casing mixed with nails and metal fragments, tore through the police line. Officer Matthias Deegan took the full force of the blast. He died within minutes, his body nearly torn in half. 6 other officers suffered fatal wounds and would die in the following weeks. 60 officers were wounded, some grievously, lost limbs, destroyed faces, abdominal wounds that would fester for months. For several seconds after the explosion, there was shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. Police began firing into the crowd indiscriminately. Officers shot wildly, many hitting their own colleagues in the confusion. Workers who were armed returned fire. Most simply ran, trampling each other in panic to escape the gunfire. The shooting lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though witnesses said it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, the square was littered with bodies. At least 4 civilians lay dead, though the true number may never be known, as many wounded workers fled rather than seeking medical treatment for fear of arrest. Dozens more suffered gunshot wounds. Police cordoned off the area. Wounded officers were carried to nearby drugstores and the police station. The dead were transported to the morgue. The bomb itself had done relatively little damage. Its casing was thin and the explosive charge modest, but the panic and gunfire that followed had created carnage. Within hours, newspapers published extra editions with sensational headlines. "Anarchy's Red Hand," "Bloody Work of Anarchists," The Chicago Tribune declared it the deed of desperate fanatics who are the enemies of society and the human race. The Chicago Times wrote, "These serpents have been warmed and nourished in the sunshine of toleration until at last they have been emboldened to strike at society, law, order, and government." Chicago police, led by Inspector Bonfield, immediately targeted the city's anarchist and socialist communities. No one had seen who threw the bomb. Witnesses provided wildly contradictory descriptions. The bomber had vanished into the crowd. Physical evidence was minimal. Yet within 24 hours, police began arresting known labor activists, radical speakers, and anyone associated with anarchist publications or organizations. The Haymarket bombing was a brief moment of anti-guerrilla, 7 seconds that killed 7 officers, but its aftermath would demonstrate how those in power could transform a mysterious act by an unknown perpetrator into justification for crushing an entire movement and executing its leaders. In the weeks following the bombing, Chicago police arrested hundreds of suspected radicals. Officers raided homes without warrants, confiscated books and newspapers as evidence of anarchism, and held suspects without charges. The entire German immigrant community came under suspicion. Anarchist thought had its strongest roots among German workers, and many labor leaders were German immigrants. Eventually, 8 men were charged with murder: Albert Parsons, August Spies, Samuel Fielden, Michael Schwab, George Engel, Adolf Fischer, Louis Ling, and Oscar Neebe. The charges were extraordinary. None of the 8 men were accused of throwing the bomb. None were even accused of knowing who threw the bomb. Instead, they were charged with murder under a conspiracy theory. Their speeches and writings had inspired someone to throw the bomb, making them accessories to murder. Albert Parsons, native-born American, former Confederate soldier, married to Lucy Parsons. He had left the Haymarket rally before the bombing, was at home when the explosion occurred, yet voluntarily surrendered to stand trial with his comrades. August Spies, German immigrant, newspaper editor, had been speaking at the rally but had left minutes before police arrived. Samuel Fielden, English immigrant, Methodist minister, was actually speaking when police arrived but climbed down peacefully. Michael Schwab, German immigrant, newspaper editor, wasn't even at Haymarket. He was miles away at another meeting. George Engel, German immigrant, printer, wasn't at Haymarket and had no connection to the bombing. Adolf Fischer, German immigrant, typesetter, wasn't at Haymarket. Louis Ling, German immigrant, carpenter, wasn't at Haymarket but had previously made bombs for defensive purposes, according to his testimony. Oscar Neebe, American-born son of German immigrants, wasn't at Haymarket. His main crime was distributing labor newspapers. The trial began in June 1886 before Judge Joseph Gary. The jury selection process was a farce. The Illinois law required jurors to be impartial, but Judge Gary openly allowed jurors who admitted prejudice against the defendants. When defense attorneys objected, Gary overruled them. The final jury consisted of men who had read sensational newspaper coverage and formed opinions about the defendants' guilt. Several admitted they believed the defendants were guilty, but claimed they could be impartial. State's Attorney Julius Grinnell presented a prosecution theory that was novel and legally dubious. The defendants were guilty of murder because their anarchist speeches and writings had created a climate that inspired someone to throw the bomb. Grinnell didn't need to prove who threw the bomb, didn't need to prove the defendants knew about the bombing plan, didn't even need to prove they were present when it occurred. He merely needed to prove they were anarchists whose ideas were dangerous. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, mostly police officers whose testimony often contradicted each other in physical evidence. Several witnesses claimed to have seen specific defendants engaged in suspicious behavior, but their descriptions were contradicted by other witnesses. The prosecution's star witness was a man named Harry Gilmer, who claimed he saw a defendant light and throw the bomb. But his description didn't match any of the defendants, and he later admitted police had pressured him to testify. The defense attorneys argued the obvious. The prosecution had no physical evidence connecting the defendants to the bombing, no credible eyewitness testimony, and no proof of a conspiracy. They pointed out that most defendants weren't even present at Haymarket. They argued that anarchist philosophy advocating for a stateless society based on voluntary cooperation was not criminal, that political speech was protected, and that holding someone responsible for an unknown person's violent interpretation of their ideas violated basic principles of justice. The defense called witnesses who testified to the defendant's whereabouts during the bombing, alibis that were solid but which the jury largely ignored. They called character witnesses who described the defendants as peaceful men, devoted fathers and husbands, hardworking members of their communities. The verdict? On August 20th, 1886, after deliberating for just 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts for all 8 defendants. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. Oscar Neebe, whose involvement was most tenuous, received 15 years in prison. The courtroom erupted. Family members screamed. Lucy Parsons, Albert's wife, collapsed. The defendants themselves remained defiant. Several shouted that they would die as martyrs to the workers' cause. The defense immediately appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court, arguing that Judge Gary had violated the defendants' constitutional rights through his biased jury selection and his instructions to the jury that appeared to presume guilt. The appeal was denied. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That appeal was also denied. The court ruled it had no jurisdiction over state criminal cases. The case attracted international attention. Labor organizations across America and Europe protested the verdicts. Writers, intellectuals, and activists recognized the trial for what it was, a political persecution designed to crush the labor movement. George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, and William Morris in England wrote essays condemning the trial. French anarchists staged demonstrations in Paris. German socialists organized protests in Berlin. Within America, however, public opinion was divided along class lines. Middle and upper-class Americans, terrified by newspaper coverage portraying anarchists as bomb-throwing terrorists, largely supported the verdicts. Working-class Americans, especially immigrants, recognized the trial as a warning. Organize, strike, or demand your rights, and you too could hang. The Haymarket trial was not an attempt to find the actual bomber, but rather a calculated effort to destroy the labor movement's leadership by criminalizing radical political thought and holding speakers responsible for the actions of unknown individuals inspired by their words. Governor Richard Oglesby faced enormous pressure. Petitions demanding clemency arrived from around the world, signed by hundreds of thousands of people. Yet he also faced pressure from Chicago's business elite to carry out the executions as a deterrent to labor organizing. On November 10, 1887, Governor Oglesby commuted the sentences of Samuel Fielden and Michael Schwab to life in prison after they signed statements requesting mercy. Louis Ling, the youngest defendant at 22, cheated the hangman. On November 10th, he smuggled a small explosive cap into his cell, placed it in his mouth, and detonated it, blowing off half his face. He lingered in agony for 6 hours before dying. November 11th, 1887. The Cook County Jail prepared for the executions. Gallows were constructed capable of hanging 4 men simultaneously. Family members were denied final visits. Officials feared they might smuggle in weapons or poison for a suicide pact. Albert Parsons, August Spies, George Engel, and Adolph Fisher were led to the gallows. They were dressed in white burial shrouds. Nooses were placed around their necks. White hoods were pulled over their faces. Their last words became legendary. Spies, there will come a time when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today. Fisher, hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life. Engel, hurrah for anarchy! Parsons, he attempted to speak at length but was cut off by the sheriff who gave the signal. His final words, will I be allowed to speak, O men of America? Let me speak, Sheriff Matson. Let the voice of the people be heard. Oh, the trapdoors opened. 4 men dropped. The hanging was botched. Parsons and Fisher died relatively quickly, but Spies and Engel strangled slowly, their necks unbroken, dancing at the end of their ropes for several minutes before death. Approximately 200 witnesses watched, many weeping. On November 13th, between 150,000 and 500,000 people, accounts vary, lined the streets of Chicago for the funeral procession. It was one of the largest public gatherings in American history to that point. The martyrs' bodies were transported through the city in a 6-hour procession. Working-class families came out in force, standing in silence as the coffins passed. Many wore red ribbons or armbands, symbols of the labor movement. Lucy Parsons walked behind her husband's coffin, dressed in black, her face a mask of grief and rage. She would spend the next 50 years of her life organizing workers, writing and speaking about labor rights, keeping her husband's memory alive until her own death in 1942. Oscar Neebe remained in prison until 1893, when newly elected Governor John Peter Altgeld reviewed the case. Altgeld concluded the trial had been unjust, that the defendants were convicted based on their political beliefs rather than evidence, and that Judge Gary had conducted the trial with clear bias. He issued full pardons for Neebe, Fielden, and Schwab, stating, "The evidence does not show that the man who threw the bomb was or ever had been in any way connected with the defendants." Altgeld's pardon was political suicide. He was vilified in the press and never won another election. But he had officially acknowledged what millions already knew. Haymarket was a judicial murder. The Haymarket martyrs became international symbols of workers' struggle. In 1889, the International Socialist Conference meeting in Paris declared May 1st, the anniversary of the 1886 general strike, as International Workers' Day in honor of the Haymarket martyrs. Today, May Day is celebrated as a workers' holiday in more than 80 countries worldwide. Ironically, America, where the events occurred, does not celebrate May Day as a labor holiday, instead observing Labor Day in September, a date chosen specifically to distance the holiday from Haymarket's radical associations. The immediate aftermath of Haymarket was a severe setback for labor. Unions lost membership, strikes were crushed, and labor leaders were imprisoned or forced underground. But the martyrs' deaths galvanized the movement in the long term. Their executions demonstrated that workers could not rely on the goodwill of employers or the fairness of the legal system. They needed political power. Over the following decades, the 8-hour movement slowly gained ground. In 1916, Congress passed the Adamson Act, establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the 40-hour workweek as the federal standard, requiring overtime pay for hours beyond 40 per week. These victories took 50 years, half a century from the Haymarket bombing to federal protecting workers' hours. The Haymarket martyrs' names are largely forgotten in America, though monuments exist. The Haymarket Martyrs Monument in Forest Home Cemetery in Chicago features a woman placing a crown of laurel on the head of a fallen worker. The inscription reads, "The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today." Every worker who enjoys a weekend, who works 8-hour shifts instead of 14-hour marathons, who has legal protections against unsafe working conditions or child labor. Everyone who benefits from modern labor law stands on the foundation built by those who fought and died at Haymarket. They were imperfect people. Their anarchist ideology was, in some respects, naive. Their rhetoric was sometimes inflammatory. Their strategies were occasionally counterproductive. But they believed fundamentally that workers deserve dignity, rest, and time to live beyond mere survival. Who threw the Haymarket bomb? We will never know with certainty. The bomber's identity died with them, if they were killed in the police gunfire or if they escaped and never confessed. Some historians believe it was Rudolf Schnaubelt, a man arrested, then released, and who fled to Europe. Others believe it was an agent provocateur, a police spy or hired agitator meant to discredit the labor movement. Still others believe it was a desperate worker, radicalized by the McCormick Massacre, acting alone. The truth is, it doesn't matter who threw the bomb, not in terms of historical impact. What matters is how the state responded, how justice was perverted, how 8 men were executed not for their actions, but for their beliefs. What matters is that workers saw clearly how those in power would respond to demands for dignity, with bullets, with biased trials, with nooses. The Haymarket martyrs' deaths transformed them from obscure labor activists into international symbols whose sacrifice demonstrated that workers' rights would not be granted voluntarily, but had to be seized through sustained struggle, legal advocacy, and political organization, ultimately leading to the labor protections we consider basic rights today. The Haymarket affair was a tragedy. 7 police officers dead, 4 workers dead, dozens wounded, 8 men executed or driven to suicide and countless families destroyed. It was also a turning point. Before Haymarket, the 8-hour movement was a scattered collection of local unions and radical groups. After Haymarket, it became an international cause, a rallying cry that would echo across continents and generations. The martyrs, Parsons, Spies, Fisher, Engel, and Lingay, were not saints. They were complicated men with ideas that many found extreme. But they saw something true that most people refused to acknowledge, that the system was rigged, that workers were being ground down by forces beyond their control, that change would require confrontation and sacrifice. They were right. Every labor protection we have today, the 40-hour work week, overtime pay, workplace safety regulations, child labor laws, workers' compensation, was won through struggle. Workers struck, marched, organized, and died. The state and corporations fought back with police violence, legal persecution, and propaganda campaigns. Progress came inch by bloody inch. When you clock out after 8 hours, when you enjoy your weekend, when you take a sick day or go on vacation. Remember Haymarket. Remember that these weren't gifts from benevolent employers. They were rights seized by workers willing to risk everything. They were bought with the blood of people whose names we've mostly forgotten, but whose legacy we live every day. The bomb that exploded in Haymarket Square on May 4th, 1886, killed 7 men in 7 seconds. But the shock wave from that explosion traveled around the world and forward through time, ultimately helping to build a world where workers have rights, dignity, and time for what we will. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. The Haymarket martyrs gave their lives for that simple demand. The least we can do is remember them. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.